This video is audio content only. It does not contain any video footage or images. If you are expecting visual content, please be aware. This is intentionally provided in an audio-only format. We recommend listening to the audio rather than watching the screen. Thank you for your understanding. Welcome, and thank you for joining this narration. Today, we'll explore the biblical account of Lot and his daughters, a story that unfolds in the aftermath of Sodom and Gomorrah's destruction. This narrative, found in Genesis, presents one of Scripture's most challenging and complex episodes, examining themes of survival, desperation, and the consequences of isolation. As we journey through this account, we'll consider the historical context, the actions of those involved, and what this story has meant to readers throughout the centuries. Prepare yourself for a thoughtful examination of a passage that continues to provoke discussion and reflection. Chapter 1. Ancient Hospitality Customs and Lot's Shocking Offer of His Daughters to the Mob. In the ancient world of the Near East, few obligations carried more weight than the sacred duty of hospitality. To welcome a stranger under your roof was to enter into a covenant, a binding agreement, enforced not merely by social custom, but by the gods themselves. When a host broke bread with a guest, they were performing an act saturated with notions of the holy. The meal became a ritual, creating a bond of trust and safety that both parties swore to uphold. Violation of this covenant was considered among the most depraved acts imaginable, so severe that Greek mythology lists it as the immediate cause of the Great Flood in works like Ovid's Metamorphoses. This understanding of hospitality as a sacred bond, rather than mere courtesy, shaped every interaction between travelers and residents throughout the ancient Mediterranean and Mesopotamian world. In regions where dangerous conditions limited travel, hospitality served an essential economic function, enabling the movement of people and goods that allowed communities to thrive. But it was far more than economics. Archaeological records and extra-biblical texts from the region attest to an honor-shame culture in which failing one's guests or allowing harm to come to them would bring profound disgrace. The obligation to protect visitors under one's roof superseded almost every other consideration. To understand what happened in Sodom that night, we must first grasp this foundational reality of ancient life. When two strangers approached Sodom in the evening, Lot encountered them. Seeing these travelers, Lot immediately bowed low to the ground, addressing them with the honorific, "My lords," and insisting they turn aside to spend the night at his house. The ancient world was hyperbolic in its expressions of courtesy. When Abraham purchased Sarah's burial plot, the negotiations began with the seller offering the land for free, but ended with Abraham being charged an exorbitant price in his grief. Similarly, Lot's invitation carried the weight of genuine insistence, not mere politeness. The strangers initially declined, saying they would spend the night in the town square. But Lot pressed them strongly until they agreed to enter his home. This persistence was not mere stubbornness. Lot understood something the strangers perhaps did not. Sodom was not a safe place for visitors. Once inside, Lot prepared a feast and baked unleavened bread for them. The sharing of this meal created the guest-host bond, a covenantal relationship that now obligated Lot and his entire household to protect these men at virtually any cost. Before the guests had retired for the night, the men of Sodom surrounded the house. The biblical text is stark in its description. Both young and old, all the people to the last man, encircled Lot's dwelling. They called out to him, demanding that he bring out the men who had come to his house so they could know them. The paralanguage, the tone and inflection that would have been obvious to original hearers, is lost to us across millennia and the shift of languages. But the violent intent is clear. These were not neighbors making a social call. They were a mob seeking to commit a grievous act against the strangers who had accepted Lot's hospitality. The men of Sodom were not interested in Lot's household. Despite living among them as part of the community, despite any existing relationships or obligations within Sodom itself, the crowd's singular focus was on these outsiders. This tells us something crucial about the nature of hospitality violations. The sacred bond between guest and host created obligations that existed independently of community membership. The Sodomites' demand was not simply an act of violence, it was a direct assault on the covenantal meal Lot had just shared with his guests. It threatened to transform the sanctuary of Lot's home into a place of violation. Lot went out to face the mob, closing the door behind him. The biblical text records his address to them, beginning with an appeal. "I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly." It is in what follows that we encounter one of the most disturbing proposals in all of Scripture. "Behold, I have 2 daughters who have not known any man. Let me bring them out to you, and do to them as you please. Only do nothing to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof." Modern readers recoil in horror at these words, and rightly so. The suggestion that a father would offer his daughters to be violated by a mob strikes at the heart of our understanding of parental protection and basic human decency. Across cultures and throughout history, the primary role of parents has been to shield their children from harm. Lot's words seem to invert this most fundamental duty. How can we possibly make sense of this moment? Ancient testimony frequently attributes righteousness to Lot, not despite this offer, but in some interpretations because of it, precisely because it was done in defense of his guests. This includes the reference in 2 Peter, which calls Lot a righteous man. For modern readers steeped in feminist consciousness and awareness of gender inequity, this ancient perspective seems incomprehensible, evidence of a hopelessly patriarchal worldview that valued male solidarity over the safety of women and girls. Yet, if we are to understand this text rather than simply judge it from our contemporary vantage point, we must consider what Lot's offer meant within the framework of his culture. First, the guest-host bond was not merely between men, but between households. Lot's wife and daughters held an equally powerful obligation to protect their guests. The entire family was bound by the covenant meal that had been shared. When the mob threatened those under Lot's roof, they threatened a sacred obligation that the whole household shared. In this light, Lot's offer was not him unilaterally disposing of his daughters as property, but the family facing together an impossible situation. Second, we must consider what Lot might have actually meant by his words. Some ancient rabbis compared his offer to Moses' willingness to offer up his own life to save Israel, when he asked God to blot him out of the book if God would not forgive the people. The comparison suggests that Lot was expressing his willingness to sacrifice anything, even the unthinkable, rather than violate the sacred duty of hospitality. This interpretation sees Lot's statement as hyperbolic, an extreme declaration meant to emphasize the absolute nature of his obligation, not a literal offer he expected to be accepted. Another interpretation considers the possibility that Lot's offer was framed to shame the men of Sodom. It functioned more as a sermon than a genuine exchange. Consider the context carefully. The Sodomites were not merely out for violence. They specifically wanted these strangers. Lot's household, as part of the community, held no interest for them. The text even notes that when they threatened Lot, they merely sought to push past him to get to his guests. Their interpretation of his offer is revealing. This fellow came to sojourn, and he has become the judge? They heard his words as moral condemnation, not as a transaction. By offering his daughters, Lot may have been forcing the mob to confront the full depravity of what they were demanding. He was saying, in effect, "You claim to want these men? Would you truly be willing to violate even the daughters of your own community to get them? For indeed, given the sacred bond of guest and host, it would be more righteous to do even the unthinkable with my own family than to stand by while these guests are abused and perhaps killed under my roof." The ancient world in which this text was written and first heard was one of extreme expressions. People spoke in hyperbole but acted with more measure. When Abraham invited these same strangers earlier in Genesis, he bowed, called them lords, referred to himself as their servant, and insisted they accept his hospitality with the same kind of urgent pressing that Lot displayed. This was the language of extreme deference that oiled the wheels of social interaction. Understanding this context helps us read Lot's offer not as a cold calculation of expendable females versus valuable guests, but as a desperate rhetorical move in an impossible moment. We cannot know for certain Lot's tone, his inflection, the look in his eyes as he spoke these words. Writing in the ancient world lacked punctuation and the sophisticated tools we use today to convey emotion and attitude on the page. Was Lot's voice dripping with sarcasm, highlighting the absurdity of what the mob was demanding? Was it thick with indignation and disappointment at his neighbors? Did he speak with incredulousness, as if to say, "You cannot possibly be serious in what you are asking"? The shift of languages and millennia make it difficult to discern the paralanguage, the emotional content that would have been immediately obvious to the original audience. What we do know is that the biblical text neither endorses Lot's offer nor records God's approval of it. The broader biblical narrative consistently condemns sexual exploitation. Instructions in Leviticus and Deuteronomy explicitly protect women and condemn those who would harm them. Scripture often records genuine human actions and errors to highlight the darker realities of sin and the need for divine intervention. The Bible is not a collection of perfect people following God flawlessly. It is a drama of how God redeemed imperfect people and used them, despite their flaws, to accomplish His purposes. Immediately after Lot's offer, the mob's response reveals their true character. Rather than accepting his proposal or backing down in shame, they surged forward threateningly. "Stand back," they demanded. "This fellow came here as an alien, and now he wants to play the judge. We'll treat you worse than them." They pressed hard against Lot and moved forward to break down the door. This reaction confirms that their intent was violent from the start, and that nothing Lot could offer would satisfy them. Their goal was the violation of the sacred bond of hospitality itself, an act of depravity that went beyond sexual violence to strike at the very foundations of civilized society. At this critical moment, the narrative takes a sudden turn. The guests reached out, pulled Lot back inside the house, and struck the men who were at the entrance with blindness. The divine intervention prevented the mob from finding the door, even as they groped for it. The angels then revealed their true mission. They had been sent to destroy Sodom because the outcry against its wickedness had reached God. They urged Lot to gather his family and flee before judgment fell. This supernatural rescue suggests something important about the narrative's purpose. God did not allow either proposed atrocity to occur, neither the violation of the guests nor the violation of Lot's daughters. The story is not about a father successfully trading his daughters for the safety of strangers. It is about a moment of moral crisis in which an impossible choice was posed but never actualized because divine power intervened to prevent any harm from befalling either the guests or Lot's family. The question remains, why does the text include this troubling episode at all? What purpose does it serve in the larger narrative? Lot's offer, whether literal or rhetorical, reveals the extreme pressure created when sacred obligations collide in a society given over to depravity. It shows us the corruption of Sodom not merely through their actions, but through how their wickedness forced even a man characterized as righteous into an impossible position where all choices seemed to lead to devastating harm. The scene illuminates the total moral collapse of a community where the basic bonds that held civilization together had completely disintegrated. But there is something else happening in this text, something that becomes clearer when we consider what follows in the subsequent chapters of Genesis. The story of Lot and his daughters is not finished when they escape Sodom. What happens next in the cave will force us to reconsider everything we thought we understood about agency, victimhood, and the long-term consequences of trauma and moral compromise. The daughters who were nearly handed over to a mob will soon make choices of their own, choices that will shape the political landscape of Israel for generations to come. Was Lot's offer on that terrifying night in Sodom the beginning of a pattern, or will the daughters' later actions represent something entirely different, a response, a reversal, or even an act of judgment? The question of who holds power and who lacks it, who protects and who endangers, who speaks and who remains silent, is about to become far more complicated than this night in Sodom first suggests. Chapter 2. Survivors or Seducers. The cave in the mountains offered shelter, but no comfort. Lot and his 2 daughters had fled Zoar, the small town where they initially sought refuge after escaping Sodom's destruction. Why Lot left Zoar remains unclear in the biblical text. Perhaps the traumatic events had left him so shaken that even a small, peaceful town felt dangerous. Perhaps he could not bear to live among other people after witnessing divine judgment fall like fire from the sky. Or perhaps he feared that Zoar, though spared at his request, might yet face a similar fate. Whatever his reasoning, Lot chose isolation. He took his daughters up into the mountains, away from civilization, into a cave where the 3 of them would dwell alone. In that cave, with nothing but rock walls and the open sky beyond, the 2 sisters faced a question that would determine their future and the future of nations yet unborn. What happens now? Their mother had looked back toward the burning city and transformed into a pillar of salt, a frozen monument to longing for what was lost. Their father sat beside them, a man who had lost his home, his wife, his livelihood, his community. Everything they had known was gone. It is here, in this moment of profound isolation, that the biblical narrative records one of its most controversial episodes. The elder daughter spoke to the younger, and her words have echoed through millennia of interpretation. Our father is old, and there is not a man in the earth to come in unto us after the manner of all the earth. She proposed a solution, shocking in its directness. They would make their father drink wine, and they would lie with him, that we may preserve seed of our father. The plan was executed on 2 consecutive nights. On the first evening, the daughters gave Lot wine until he was intoxicated. The elder daughter then went in and lay with him. The text specifically notes that he perceived not when she lay down, nor when she arose. The following night, the elder daughter urged the younger to do the same. Again Lot drank wine. Again a daughter lay with him. Again the text emphasizes his lack of awareness. Both daughters conceived. In due time, the elder gave birth to a son she named Moab, meaning from father, an explicit acknowledgement of the incestuous union. The younger bore a son named Ben-Ami, meaning son of my people. For most of history, this story has been read as a tale of female seduction, a warning about the dangers of wine and women. Renaissance and Baroque artists in particular embraced this interpretation, creating canvases charged with sensuality. The story became a license for painters and their patrons to indulge in depictions of sexuality under the guise of moral instruction. The implicit message of these artistic renderings was clear. Women are cunning, wine is dangerous, and even righteous men can be led astray by female wiles. This reading interprets the daughters as perpetrators, initiators of an incestuous crime. Some modern scholars have explicitly used the language of rape to describe the daughters' actions. Feminist critics like Esther Fuchs have challenged traditional interpretations, arguing that the daughters should be understood as initiators and perpetrators of sexual violence against their unconscious father. In this framework, the text presents a troubling inversion, where women become aggressors and the man becomes their victim. The Hebrew verb the elder daughter uses when she says, "Let us lie with him," carries a meaning in this context that some scholars argue approaches assault. The daughters are viewed not merely as survivors making desperate choices, but as agents who violate their intoxicated, unconscious father. They knew their plan required deception, otherwise they would not have needed to intoxicate him. Their moral formation in Sodom is explored in chapter 3, but the bare fact remains. They acted, he did not consent, and what followed was incest. Yet this condemnatory reading, dominant though it has been, does not capture the full complexity of the text or the interpretive tradition surrounding it. There is another way to understand what happened in that cave, one that has deep roots in Jewish and early Christian interpretation. This alternative reading sees the daughters not as seducers, but as survivors who made a terrible choice under unimaginable pressure. According to this view, the key to understanding the daughters' actions lies in the elder sister statement, "There is not a man in the earth." Jewish tradition, reflected in Genesis Rabbah 51 and endorsed by early church fathers including Augustine, Chrysostom, and Irenaeus, interprets this literally. The daughters genuinely believed that the entire world had been destroyed, that they and their father were the only 3 humans left alive. They had witnessed fire fall from heaven and consume not just Sodom and Gomorrah, but all the cities of the plain. They had seen their mother literally petrified as she looked back. They had fled to a cave in the mountains, isolated from any signs of human life. In their traumatized state, they concluded that what happened to the cities of the plain had happened everywhere. This was not merely local judgment, but global apocalypse, a second great flood, this time by fire instead of water. From this perspective, the daughters' actions were not driven by lust or malice, but by a sense of sacred duty. If they truly believed themselves the last 3 people on earth, then the survival of humanity depended on them producing offspring. And there was only one man available, their father. The reference to doing things after the manner of all the earth takes on new meaning in this reading. They were not planning something aberrant, but attempting to restore the normal human pattern of marriage and childbearing under utterly abnormal circumstances. Just as Noah and his family repopulated the earth after the flood, the daughters saw themselves as the remnant from whom humanity would be renewed. Compare this to another biblical story of irregular procreation, Tamar and Judah in Genesis 38. When Judah's sons died and he failed to give Tamar his youngest son as required by Levirate law, Tamar disguised herself as a prostitute and conceived children by her father-in-law through deception. Like Lot's daughters, she used sexual transgression and trickery to preserve a family line. And the text treats her favorably. Judah himself declares, "She is more righteous than I." From Tamar and Judah's union came Perez, an ancestor of King David. The parallel suggests that the Bible recognizes desperate measures to continue a lineage, even when those measures violate sexual boundaries. Both stories involve what one scholar calls sperm stealing, and both perpetrators end up as direct ancestors of Israel's royal line. The Midrashic literature develops the sympathetic reading of Lot's daughters further. Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer notes that the daughters had no wine in the cave where they were hiding. How then did they intoxicate their father? A miracle occurred. The cave itself became like a prefigurement of the world to come, dripping with wine, just as the prophet Joel envisioned mountains flowing with wine in the Messianic age. Another Midrashic observation notes that typically a virgin does not conceive from her first sexual encounter. Yet both of Lot's daughters, explicitly described as virgins, became pregnant after lying with their father only once. This, too, was presented as miraculous evidence that God's hand was guiding events. Most strikingly, Genesis Rabbah declares that while by strict legal standards the daughters deserve to be executed for incest, God judged them not by their deeds but by their intentions. The Holy One knew their thoughts, knew they had no designs on their father sexually, knew they were motivated solely by the desire to prevent human extinction. Therefore, God not only spared them from punishment, but showed mercy toward their descendants. But this Midrashic defense raises a profound theological problem. Can good intentions transform an intrinsically evil act into a good one? The Catholic theological tradition, articulated in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, explicitly rejects this possibility. The Catechism states that circumstances and intentions cannot transform an intrinsically evil act into a good or acceptable one, paragraph 1756. By this standard, no matter how pure the daughters' motives, no matter how genuine their belief that humanity's survival depended on them, the act itself remained gravely wrong. This theological framework challenges the midrashic reading at its foundation. If incest is intrinsically evil, then even the most desperate circumstances and the most noble intentions cannot make it permissible. The tension between these interpretations points to fundamentally different understandings of how God evaluates human action. Does God judge primarily the act or primarily the intention behind the act? Can context excuse what would otherwise be inexcusable? The midrashic tradition tends toward emphasizing divine knowledge of human hearts and motivations. God sees what humans cannot, the full context, the complete picture of why someone acted as they did. The Catholic tradition, by contrast, maintains that certain acts are wrong regardless of circumstances or intentions, that moral absolutes exist which even desperation cannot override. There is yet another layer to consider, one that complicates both the seductress and the survivor readings. Some rabbinic sources suggest that Lot himself bears more responsibility than the text initially suggests. A small marking in the Hebrew text, a dot over the word translated arose in the phrase describing the first night, drew the attention of ancient commentators. This dot indicates something unusual, something requiring attention. Their interpretation? While Lot was indeed drunk when his elder daughter lay down beside him, he was conscious and aware when she got up. He knew what had happened. Yet the next night he drank wine again, and the same thing occurred with his younger daughter. If this reading is correct, then Lot was not simply a passive victim on the second night. He knew what was happening and chose to drink anyway. Some commentators go further, suggesting that the entire episode becomes a form of divine justice, a measure-for-measure punishment. Lot had offered to hand his daughters over to a mob to be violated. Now, in the privacy of the cave, an act he had been willing to see done to his daughters would be done, but to him instead. As one midrash dramatically phrases it, whoever is driven by his hunger for transgression will eventually be fed from his own flesh. This reading invites us to reconsider the power dynamics in the cave. Who was in control? Who lacked agency? If Lot was at least partially aware, at least on the second night, then the equation shifts. The question of consent becomes murkier, the assignment of moral responsibility more complex. Consider also the act of naming. In the patriarchal world of the ancient Near East, naming a child was typically the father's prerogative. Names mattered immensely. They conveyed identity, destiny, connection to the divine. Yet when Moab and Ben-Ami are born, it is not Lot who names them, but their mothers. The elder daughter names her son Moab. The younger daughter names her son Ben-Ami. Lot, who is still alive at this point, is entirely absent from the naming scenes. The text presents the daughters as acting with complete autonomy in this most fundamental parental act. The names themselves announce what happened: from father and son of my people. No attempt at concealment, no euphemism. The scandal is proclaimed in the very names of the children. What kind of story is this? Is it condemnation or explanation? Is it about female duplicity or female survival? Perhaps the most honest answer is that it is all of these things at once. The biblical narrative is remarkably unsqueamish about moral ambiguity. It presents human beings in all their complexity, capable of both noble intentions and terrible actions, sometimes simultaneously. What we can say with certainty is what the text explicitly tells us, and what it carefully avoids telling us. We know the daughters believed there was no man in the earth. We do not know if this belief was reasonable or a failure to remember that Zoar still existed. We know they intended to preserve their father's line. We do not know if this intention was selfless concern for humanity or practical worry about their own security. We know Lot was drunk enough not to perceive his daughter's actions. We do not know if this unconsciousness was total and continuous, or if there were moments of awareness. The text itself remains notably quiet about explicit judgment. Unlike other narratives where divine displeasure is immediately clear, where prophets pronounce woe, where punishments swiftly follow sins, this story simply reports what happened and then moves on. God does not strike the daughters dead. No prophet appears to condemn them. The narrator offers no moral aside. We are left with the facts of what occurred and must grapple with the complexity on our own. The lasting question is not whether the daughters' actions were morally justified. By the Torah's own later standards in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, they were not. The question is how we understand their agency, their victimhood, their survival, and their place in the larger story. Are they primarily perpetrators who committed incest, or primarily survivors who made a devastating choice under catastrophic pressure? Can they be both at once? And when we discover how their descendants would eventually play a role in sacred history, what does that tell us about how God works through even the most morally ambiguous origins? The cave scene forces us to ask what we truly believe about intentions and acts, about survival and sin, about who deserves condemnation and who deserves compassion when all options are terrible and no choice is good. Chapter 3. The City That Shaped Them. When Lot first laid eyes on the Jordan Valley, he saw paradise. The land was well-watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt. Green and fertile and lush, it promised prosperity. Standing beside his uncle Abraham on the heights, surveying the territory they would need to divide between them, Lot made a choice that would echo through generations. He chose the plain. He chose the cities. He chose Sodom. This progression from proximity to participation captures something essential about how environmental corruption works. Lot did not wake up one morning and decide to abandon the faith and practices he had learned traveling with Abraham. The text records a gradual movement. He pitched his tent toward Sodom, then moved into the city itself, then took his place at the gate where legal and commercial matters were conducted. Each step seemed reasonable. Each brought him closer to an environment that would ultimately shape him more than he shaped it. The gate where Lot sat was where judges settled disputes, where elders administered justice, where the business of civic life unfolded. According to ancient Near Eastern custom reflected throughout the Torah, this was where cases were heard and decisions made that affected the entire community. That Lot held this position meant he had achieved standing in Sodom, integration into its power structures. The irony would become apparent. He served as a judge in a city where justice itself had been corrupted, where legal authority operated in service of systems that violated every principle he had learned from Abraham. What kind of city was Sodom? The prophet Ezekiel, pronouncing judgment on Jerusalem centuries later, used Sodom as the ultimate comparison. But his description is striking in what it emphasizes. Before mentioning sexual immorality or violence, Ezekiel names the root. Behold, this was the guilt of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters had pride, excess of food, and prosperous ease, but did not aid the poor and needy. They were haughty and did an abomination before me. This was environmental corruption at its most insidious. Sodom was a place where trade routes converged, where agricultural surplus from the well-watered plain filled storehouses, where wealth accumulated in the hands of those who controlled commerce. Archaeological evidence from the region suggests cities in the Jordan Valley served as waypoints for caravans moving between Egypt and Mesopotamia, positioning them to profit from the exchange of luxury goods: Egyptian linen, Mesopotamian metalwork, spices from Arabia. The biblical description of the plain as being like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, indicates extraordinary fertility, the kind of agricultural abundance that freed people from daily worry about survival. But prosperity had bred arrogance rather than gratitude, ease rather than generosity. The daily rhythms of Sodom taught that individual autonomy mattered more than mutual obligation, that the accumulation of comfort was life's highest good, that those who lacked wealth or status deserved their poverty. In the markets where Lot's daughters would have accompanied their mother to buy food, they would have seen the poor turned away, their pleas for help met with contempt or ignored entirely. In the squares where merchants displayed their wares, they would have watched transactions conducted with an assumption that everything had a price, that wealth granted power over others, that those with means owed nothing to those without. The text describes Lot's daughters as betrothed to men of Sodom. In ancient Near Eastern custom, betrothal was not the tentative engagement modern readers imagine. It established a legal marriage bond. The betrothed woman was already considered a wife even before the couple began living together. When Lot later warned these sons-in-law that God would destroy the city, their response revealed the worldview that permeated Sodom's culture. They thought he was jesting. These were men so thoroughly formed by an environment where the sacred made no claims on behavior that the concept of divine judgment seemed laughable. They could not conceive of a reality where moral boundaries mattered, where actions had consequences beyond the immediate, where a power greater than human desire or human will might intervene in affairs. This was the civic culture in which Lot's daughters came of age. Every interaction they witnessed in the streets, every conversation they overheard in their home, every assumption embedded in how business was conducted and disputes were settled, taught them lessons about what mattered and what did not. The poor were invisible or contemptible. Strangers were to be suspected rather than welcomed. Wealth and comfort were worth pursuing by any means. Sexual boundaries existed to be transgressed. The strong did what they pleased. The weak suffered what they must. The psychological literature on trauma speaks of how overwhelming events shatter a person's basic assumptions about the world. But environmental corruption works differently. It is the steady accumulation of compromises, the daily accommodation to standards that violate what a person knows somewhere deep down to be right, the gradual dulling of moral sensibilities under the pressure of surrounding norms. Lot's daughters did not experience one traumatic night in Sodom. They experienced years of formation in a culture where boundaries were routinely violated, where women were treated as property, where deception was a tool of survival, where the poor were left to starve while the prosperous feasted, where the concept of obligation to those outside one's immediate interest was treated with scorn. The contrast with Abraham's choices becomes stark. Abraham also journeyed through Canaan. He also faced temptation to compromise, most notably in Egypt when he asked Sarah to say she was his sister. Abraham was imperfect, capable of moral failures. But Abraham never settled in the cities of the plain. He never integrated himself into urban culture. He dwelt in tents, maintained the posture of a sojourner, built altars, called on the name of the Lord. When conflict arose between his herdsmen and Lot's, Abraham let Lot choose first which direction to go, demonstrating that prosperity mattered less than peace. His choice to remain separate from the corrupt centers of Canaanite civilization meant that his household was shaped by different daily rhythms, different assumptions about what mattered, different reflexes when crisis came. Lot chose differently. He chose the well-watered plain because it promised economic opportunity. He moved his tent toward Sodom because proximity to the city meant access to markets and commerce. He eventually moved inside the walls because urban life offered comfort and security that nomadic existence could not. Each choice made sense in isolation. Together, they placed his family in an environment that taught them day after day, year after year, that certain things were normal, acceptable, inevitable. The Torah itself, when it later prohibits Israel from settling in the land, repeatedly warns against adopting the practices of surrounding nations. The Israelites are told not to walk in the customs of the peoples God is driving out before them. The land itself, the text warns, can become defiled by the practices of its inhabitants and will vomit out those who commit abominations. This language of defilement is not merely about individual acts, but about environmental corruption, about how living in the midst of certain practices normalizes them, makes them seem reasonable, erodes the boundaries that protect holiness. Lot's story illustrates exactly this process. He entered Sodom as someone who had walked with Abraham, who had seen divine messengers, who knew about covenant and altar and calling on God. But the environment worked on him, slowly, persistently. By the time the angels arrived to deliver him, he had to be physically dragged from the city. He hesitated. He negotiated for a different escape route. He could not simply obey and go. The tendrils of Sodom had wrapped around his heart, making a clean break almost impossible even with angelic assistance. His daughters, having spent their entire formative years in this environment, showed even more dramatic effects. They carried no memory of tent-dwelling with Abraham, no experience of building altars, no habit of calling on the Lord when faced with uncertainty. What they carried was the accumulated weight of daily lessons learned in Sodom, that the vulnerable were on their own, that security came through strategic action rather than trust, that sexual boundaries served no ultimate purpose, that survival meant taking what you needed by whatever means available. When the city burned and they fled to the cave, they carried all of this with them. Their betrothed, men so thoroughly formed by Sodom they could not conceive of God judging sin, perished in the flames. Everything familiar was gone. But the habits of mind, the patterns of thought, the moral reflexes developed through years in that environment, those came with them into the isolation of the mountains. What happened next would reveal the full extent of Sodom's corruption on their moral formation. Chapter 4. Enemy Nations and the Seeds of Redemption. Following the daughter's desperate act in the cave, sons were born who would become the fathers of nations. This story is a political document, an origin story deliberately crafted to define the relationship between Israel and two of its most persistent neighbors. The Moabites settled east of the Dead Sea in the fertile plateau lands. The Ammonites established themselves in the hill country northeast of Israel, around what is today the city of Amman in Jordan. These were not distant peoples known only through rumor. They were immediate neighbors with whom Israel would have constant, complex interactions, sometimes trading partners, sometimes military rivals, sometimes intermarrying, sometimes at war. How does a people explain such neighbors, so close and yet so other? The answer provided in Genesis is an origin story that simultaneously affirms kinship and establishes distance. Yes, these nations are related to Israel through Lot, nephew of Abraham. But their origin is tainted by the worst kind of sexual transgression. They are family, but disgraced family. This is political commentary masquerading as historical narrative, and the masquerade is paper thin. Every element is calibrated to stigmatize while explaining, to acknowledge connection while establishing grounds for separation. The political work this story accomplishes becomes clearer when we trace what happens to these nations in Israel's history. When the Israelites wandered in the wilderness after the Exodus, King Balak of Moab hired the prophet Balaam to curse them. Though God prevented the curses, turning them into blessings, Moabite women soon after seduced Israelite men into worshiping Baal of Peor. This incident became so infamous that Numbers records a plague killing 24,000 Israelites, and the episode was cited generations later as an example of Moabite treachery. The book of Judges records that Moab conquered and occupied parts of Israel, with the Israelites serving Eglon, king of Moab, for 18 years. The judge Ehud ended this by assassinating Eglon in a scene of brutal intimacy. He approached the obese king in his upper chamber, told him he had a message from God, and thrust a sword so deep into Eglon's belly that the fat closed over the blade and the handle disappeared. King David dealt with Moab so harshly that he had 2/3 of the Moabite prisoners executed, forcing the remaining third into servitude. The prophets showed no mercy in their oracles. Isaiah devoted chapters 15 and 16 to Moab's coming destruction. Let Moab wail, let everyone wail for Moab. Mourn, utterly stricken, for the raisin cakes of Kir Hareseth. The fields of Heshbon languish, and the vines of Sibmah. Jeremiah proclaimed, Moab will be destroyed and broken down. Wail for him, Cry, announce by the Arnon that Moab is laid waste. Amos condemned Moab for desecrating the bones of the king of Edom. Zephaniah compared Moab to Sodom itself, declaring the nation would become a place of nettles and salt pits and perpetual desolation. The Ammonites fared no better. They worshipped Molech, a god associated with child sacrifice. During the period of the Judges, they repeatedly attacked Israel. King Saul's first major military victory came against Nahash the Ammonite, who had besieged an Israelite city and offered humiliating terms. Peace only if he could gouge out the right eye of every inhabitant. David's dealings with Ammon ended in war after the Ammonite king's advisors convinced him that David's envoys were spies, leading to the men being humiliated by having half their beards shaved and their garments cut off at the buttocks. The resulting war ended with David conquering the Ammonite capital and subjugating the population to forced labor. Amos condemned Ammon for ripping open pregnant women in Gilead. Jeremiah and Ezekiel both proclaimed Ammon's coming desolation. This catalog forms a pattern. Moab and Ammon are consistently portrayed as hostile neighbors, proud and arrogant, worshiping false gods, leading Israel into sin. Their character as nations mirrors the character of their origin, transgressive, existing in a space that violates proper boundaries. Just as their conception blurred the line between father and daughter, between generation and generation, so these nations blur the line between kin and enemy. They are close enough to be dangerous, familiar enough to be tempting, related enough to make their hostility feel like betrayal. Yet when the Israelites prepared to enter the Promised Land, God gave Moses explicit instructions. Do not harass Moab or Ammon. Do not provoke them to war. I have given their land to the descendants of Lot as a possession, and I will not give you any of it. The same God who commanded Israel to utterly destroy the Canaanite nations forbade Israel from attacking these two. The reason given is their connection to Lot, Abraham's nephew. God remembers covenant promises, and that memory extends even to the nations born from Lot's darkest moment. The sacred text itself records this protection in Deuteronomy, establishing that while these nations would often be hostile, they retained a status as protected kin. This protection had limits. Deuteronomy establishes that no Ammonite or Moabite may enter the assembly of the Lord, even to the 10th generation. The prohibition is grounded in historical offenses. They did not meet Israel with bread and water on the journey from Egypt, and they hired Balaam to curse Israel. Yet this boundary contains a remarkable exception. The prohibition applies explicitly only to males, not to females. A Moabite woman or an Ammonite woman could convert and join Israel. This exception appears nowhere else in biblical laws about excluded nations. The Talmudic tradition explains it as a divine reward for the good intentions of Lot's daughters in the cave. Through that open door walked Ruth. She was a Moabite, a direct descendant of that elder daughter. When her Israelite husband died and her mother-in-law Naomi prepared to return to Israel, Ruth spoke words that would echo through all of Scripture. Where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. She crossed the boundary, left Moab, and entered Israel, committed herself to the God of Israel. She married Boaz, a righteous Israelite man, and bore a son named Obed. Obed had a son named Jesse. Jesse had a son named David, who would become Israel's greatest king. The genealogy recorded in Ruth chapter 4 makes this explicit. Boaz fathered Obed, Obed fathered Jesse, and Jesse fathered David. The story that began with incest in a cave, designed to stigmatize Israel's enemy neighbors, becomes the backstory for the Davidic monarchy. The political commentary that associated Moab with sexual transgression becomes, through Ruth, the channel through which God establishes the royal line. When Matthew lists Jesus' ancestors, he explicitly names Ruth, marking her as Moabite even as she stands in the line leading to the Messiah. The attempt to permanently other the Moabites through an incest origin story fails, because God's redemptive purposes refuse to honor the boundaries humans draw to mark people as forever unclean. If the story functioned only to give Israel grounds for keeping troublesome neighbors at arm's length, then Ruth's inclusion in the royal line would be an embarrassment to hide. Instead, Scripture highlights it. The book of Ruth tells her story in loving detail. The genealogies preserve her name and her national origin. She is remembered not despite being a Moabite, but as a Moabite whose loyalty surpassed that of many native-born Israelites. The shameful beginning did not determine everything that would follow. The nations that came from that cave were hostile to Israel more often than not, were judged by the prophets, were prohibited from full participation in Israel's assembly. But they were also protected from destruction by divine command, and capable of producing individuals who could cross the boundary and become not merely Israelites, but ancestresses of kings. Perhaps the story's deepest political commentary is not about Moab and Ammon at all, but about Israel itself. If the royal line runs through a Moabite woman whose ancestors were conceived in an act of incest, if God's chosen King David carries in his veins the blood of Lot's desperate daughters, then no origin is too shameful for redemption to reach. The boundaries humans establish to protect purity and maintain superiority are constantly being crossed by divine mercy. The neighbors we stigmatize through origin stories may turn out to be the very ones through whom God chooses to work. The sons born in that cave became fathers of nations that worshipped God's demanding child sacrifice, that fought against Israel, that tried to curse Israel through hired prophets. Everything the prophets said about their pride and violence appears to have been true. And yet, somewhere in the midst of all that hostility, a Moabite woman refused to abandon her widowed mother-in-law, came to Israel, and became the great-grandmother of David. The question this leaves is not whether the origin story was propaganda, but why God would bring the royal line through exactly the nation Israel most wanted to stigmatize, and what that choice demands of everyone who tries to draw permanent lines between us and them, righteous and unclean, family and enemy.
Chapter 5. From Medieval Shadow to Renaissance Canvas. For most of the Middle Ages, the story of Lot and his daughters remained largely invisible in the visual arts of Europe. The biblical tale was known, of course, taught from pulpits and referenced in theological texts, but painters and sculptors rarely chose to depict it. When they did illustrate episodes from Lot's life, they gravitated toward other moments: the angels visiting Sodom, the mob at the door, the family fleeing the burning city. The scene in the cave, where daughters made their father drunk and lay with him, appeared almost nowhere in the illuminated manuscripts, frescoes, and altarpieces that filled medieval churches and monasteries. This silence was not accidental. Medieval Christian art served primarily devotional and instructional purposes, meant to elevate the soul toward contemplation of sacred mysteries and moral virtue. A story centered on incest, even incest recorded in Scripture, did not easily lend itself to such purposes. When the scene did occasionally appear in medieval contexts, it was handled with restraint bordering on awkwardness. The focus fell on the daughters offering wine to their father, a moment of action that preceded the sexual transgression rather than depicting it. The compositions were stiff, the figures formal and distanced from any sense of physical intimacy. These rare medieval images functioned as moral warnings, visual reminders that drunkenness led to sin, that living among the wicked corrupted even the righteous, that wine loosened the restraints that kept families within proper bounds. Then, beginning in the 16th century, something shifted. The story of Lot and his daughters suddenly became one of the most frequently painted subjects in Northern European art. Within a few decades, the scene that had been almost invisible for 1,000 years appeared on canvas after canvas, in print after print, commissioned by wealthy patrons and displayed in prominent places. This explosion of interest demands explanation. What changed? Why did an obscure and disturbing biblical episode abruptly become so popular that dozens of major artists felt compelled to tackle it? The answer lies at the intersection of several cultural currents that converged in Renaissance Europe. First, the rediscovery of classical learning and the rise of humanism encouraged artists to explore a wider range of subjects, including Old Testament narratives that offered dramatic human stories rather than purely devotional themes. Second, the Protestant Reformation's emphasis on Scripture created new interest in biblical scenes that had been neglected by medieval Catholic tradition. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the story of Lot's daughters provided artists and patrons with something they increasingly desired: a religiously sanctioned excuse to create and display images of nude female bodies engaged in sexually charged scenarios.
The subject fit neatly into an established artistic tradition known as Weibermacht, or Weiberlisten, the power of women theme. This tradition featured Old Testament and classical heroines who used feminine wiles to overcome powerful men. Delilah cutting Samson's hair, Judith beheading Holofernes, Jael driving a tent peg through Sisera's temple. These images simultaneously warned against female cunning and invited viewers to admire the women's beauty and strategic intelligence. Lot's Daughters became another entry in this catalog, their story offering both moral instruction about the dangers of wine and women and visual pleasure in the depiction of female flesh. The Dutch printmaker Lucas van Leyden produced an engraving of Lot and his daughters in 1530 that established many of the conventions subsequent artists would follow. In his version, the story's setting in a cave after fleeing catastrophe recedes into insignificance. Instead, the viewer's eye is immediately drawn to the bodies of two young women, rendered with careful attention to every curve and contour. They are presented as wily seductresses, their nakedness on full display, their postures designed to maximize erotic appeal. Lot himself, rather than appearing as the elderly, exhausted refugee the biblical text describes, is shown as a vigorous man in his prime, his expression suggesting not unconscious drunkenness, but eager participation in what is about to occur. The burning city appears only as a tiny background detail, a visual footnote that barely registers. What registers instead is flesh, wine, and the promise of forbidden pleasure. This approach became the template for countless variations. Joachim Wedewael, painting around 1595, added a note of luxurious excess to the scene. His Lot and daughters are surrounded by an improbable abundance of food: grapes in heavy clusters, fresh baked bread, and a magnificent stack of cheese that towers in the foreground. The bread and wine carry Christological symbolism, the elements of communion transformed into props for transgression. The daughters are young and nubile, their skin glowing with health and painted with the kind of attention that invites the viewer's gaze to linger. Wedewael's composition suggests that the sin being depicted is not merely incest but gluttony, a giving in to every form of appetite and bodily indulgence. Yet for all the moralizing that such symbolism might imply, the painting's primary effect is sensual rather than cautionary. It is a feast for the eyes in every sense, an invitation to visual consumption that mirrors the physical consumption happening within the scene. The Flemish master Peter Paul Rubens returned to the subject multiple times, creating at least two major versions around 1610 through 1614. Rubens brought his characteristic approach, powerful, muscular bodies painted with supreme technical virtuosity, compositions that seem to pulse with life and movement, colors that glow with warmth. In his version, showing the scene in the cave, Lot is presented as a figure of raw physical power, his musculature catching the light as he leans toward his daughter. His face is flushed. Whether from wine or desire, the painting leaves deliberately ambiguous, and his expression radiates aggressive lust rather than drunken oblivion. The blonde-haired daughter beside him looks pale and almost apprehensive in contrast, yet her hand reaches out to refill his cup even as she meets his gaze. The other sister completes the triangle, her gesture offering more wine in a golden vessel whose opulence speaks to the wealth and taste of the patron who commissioned this work. Every surface glows: skin, fabric, metal. Rubens has transformed a story about desperate survival in a cave into a scene of Baroque splendor and barely restrained carnality. Other artists found different notes to strike within the same subject. Rembrandt, collaborating with the printmaker Jan van Vliet in 1631, discovered comedy in Lot's drunkenness. His etching shows the old man bleary-eyed and singing rowdily, his wine cup raised high while drops of wine drip from its empty bowl. His robes fall open at the waist, one stocking has slipped down to reveal a creased and elderly knee, and his legs stick out at an angle that suggests he has lost all capacity for dignified posture. It is an image of drunken indignity pushed to the edge of farce, making Lot a figure of ridicule rather than tragedy. The daughters in this version are clearly in control, pursuing their plan while their father bumbles about, oblivious to what they intend. The Italian painter Guido Reni offered a notably different interpretation in his version painted around 1615. Reni stripped away almost all the usual narrative details. There is no burning city in the background, no piles of food or obvious symbols of excess and sin. The drunkenness and lust that dominate northern versions are absent. Instead, Reni presents what appears to be a sober patriarch engaged in reasoned conversation with his two daughters. They are fully clothed, their postures suggesting deliberation rather than seduction. The daughters are painted with idealized classical beauty, their faces and figures modeled on ancient statuary Reni had studied during his years in Rome. The scene is restrained, almost dignified, inviting the viewer to consider the moral and existential dilemma the family faces rather than to indulge in voyeuristic pleasure. Yet even here, the choice to depict this moment at all, to paint these three figures in their intimate conference, carries an undercurrent of the scandalous subject matter that the smooth surfaces and classical composition work to contain. Against this backdrop of male artists interpreting the story according to the conventions and desires of their time, the work of Artemisia Gentileschi stands apart. Painted around 1636 through 1638, her version breaks decisively with the dominant traditions. Artemisia was herself a survivor of sexual violence. As a young woman studying painting under her father Oracio's tutelage, she had been raped by Agostino Tassi, another artist her father had hired as her instructor. The subsequent trial was brutal. Artemisia was tortured during her testimony to verify she was telling the truth, while Tassi faced minimal consequences. This experience shaped how she approached subjects involving women, power, and sexual violation. In Artemisia's painting, one daughter is positioned with the burning city of Sodom behind her. This compositional choice does something none of the male artists had done. It places the daughter's decision in the immediate context of the catastrophe they had just survived. The viewer is reminded that these women have lost everything. They have witnessed divine judgment fall like fire from the sky. They are alone with their father in a cave, believing themselves the last people on earth. The decision they make unfolds not in Baroque splendor or comic drunkenness or classical restraint, but in the raw aftermath of trauma. The daughters in Artemisia's version are tender toward their father. Their expressions show concern rather than calculation, care rather than cunning. When they exchange glances, the look between them speaks of sisterly solidarity, of two women facing an impossible situation together and supporting each other through it. The painting refuses to cast them as either innocent victims or wicked seducers. Instead, it presents them as human beings making choices under catastrophic pressure, acting from a complex mixture of fear, duty, desperation, and love. Artemisia paints the position of one daughter's legs echoing her father's, the slung legs motif that other artists used as a symbol of sexual union.
But here it suggests family unity rather than manipulation. Three people bound together by circumstance and by blood, confronting a future that offers no good options. What makes Artemisia's interpretation so striking is how it redirects the viewer's attention away from eroticism and moral judgment towards something harder to depict and harder to watch: the moral ambiguity that arises when people in extreme situations must choose between terrible alternatives. Rather than condemning her protagonists or celebrating them, rather than using them as objects for visual pleasure or as warnings about vice, Artemisia points to the unavoidable complexity of their situation. The painting does not excuse incest, but it also does not reduce the women to scheming temptresses or their father to either dupe or willing participant. It asks the viewer to see them as a family facing choices that should never have to be faced. Her father Orazio had painted his own version of Lot and his daughters around 1622, taking yet another approach. He chose to depict the morning after, the moment when consequences are beginning to dawn, but before they have fully manifested. The wine flask is empty, the gilded cup lies discarded, and Lot sleeps in the lap of one daughter while the other points towards something beyond the viewer's sight. Dawn breaks over the distant hills. There is a sense of the future arriving, of time moving forward, whether the participants are ready or not. One daughter's bare shoulder and exposed legs hint at what happened during the night, but there is also a quality of stillness, of aftermath rather than action. Orazio, like his daughter Artemisia, used live models and dressed them in simple contemporary clothing rather than elaborate costumes, giving the scene a directness and immediacy that more theatrical compositions lack. What emerges from this survey of artistic treatments is not a simple progression from medieval restraint to Renaissance license, but a revealing pattern about the relationship between text and image, between sacred story and cultural appetite. The same biblical narrative could be made to serve radically different purposes depending on who was painting it, for whom, and why. For most Northern European artists, the story offered license to paint the female nude under the protective cover of biblical subject matter. A patron who might have been uncomfortable commissioning a straightforwardly mythological scene of seduction could justify hanging Lot and his daughters in his home because it was scripture, because it carried a moral warning. That the warning came packaged in images of naked young women whose every curve had been lovingly rendered reveals the fundamental paradox. These were simultaneously moral warnings and erotic invitations, cautionary tales and occasions for pleasure. This paradox tells us something about how visual culture operates. The paintings functioned as sites where competing desires could coexist without acknowledging their contradiction. A viewer could ostensibly contemplate the dangers of wine and female wiles while simultaneously indulging in the visual pleasure of rendered flesh. The sacred text provided moral cover for an activity that was primarily about looking at women's bodies. This was not hypocrisy so much as a cultural mechanism for negotiating the gap between stated values and actual desires. The existence of these paintings in such abundance suggests that patrons, artists, and viewers all understood this unspoken arrangement, even if they would not have articulated it explicitly. The question of gender becomes unavoidable. Why were women's bodies available for this kind of visual consumption while men's bodies were not? Why did the story become primarily about displaying the daughters rather than exploring Lot's complicity or confusion? The answer lies in the male gaze that dominated artistic production and consumption in Renaissance Europe. Artists were almost exclusively male, patrons were overwhelmingly male, and the assumed viewer whose pleasure mattered was male. Women's bodies could be displayed, examined, eroticized under the guise of moral instruction because the culture gave men permission to look at women in ways that women were not permitted to look at men. Artemisia's version challenges this dynamic precisely because it came from someone whose experience as a woman and as a survivor of sexual violence gave her a different perspective on vulnerability and agency. She could not see the daughters as objects for visual pleasure because she understood what it meant to be treated as an object herself. Her painting restores subjectivity to the women, asking what they might have felt rather than how they might have appeared to male viewers. This was not merely a different artistic choice, but a different ethical stance toward the act of representation itself.
The vast gallery of artistic responses to Lot and his daughters ultimately demonstrates how interpretation works when text becomes image. Every artist made choices about what to emphasize and what to minimize, about which moment to depict and which to leave in shadow, about whether to portray the daughters as agents or victims, Lot as innocent or complicit, the act as tragedy or sin or desperate survival. These choices were never neutral. They served the interests of patrons who commissioned the work, audiences who viewed it, artists working through personal preoccupations and technical challenges, and a culture that determined what could be shown and how it would be interpreted. The story that begins as text, ambiguous, open to multiple readings, becomes in visual form something more fixed, more physical, more implicated in the power dynamics of looking and being looked at. What we see in these paintings is not the biblical story itself, but centuries of cultural negotiation about gender, power, desire, morality, and the permissible boundaries of representation. The transformation from medieval shadow to Renaissance canvas reveals less about Lot and his daughters than about what each generation needed this story to mean.
The story of Lot and his daughters refuses to offer easy answers. It presents moral ambiguity where we crave clarity, depicts choices made under catastrophic pressure, and shows how environmental corruption shapes even those who believe themselves separate from it. Most remarkably, it demonstrates that God's redemptive purposes flow through exactly the origins we most want to stigmatize. From a cave marked by trauma and transgression came Moab, and from Moab came Ruth, and from Ruth came David, and through David's line came the hope of redemption itself. What we make of this story reveals as much about us as about them. Each generation has seen its own concerns reflected in these ancient figures, sometimes victims, sometimes perpetrators, sometimes both at once. Perhaps that's the point. Human beings facing impossible choices in broken circumstances rarely fit neatly into categories we create to make sense of the world. Thank you for listening.